Okay, spell my name. Last name first is Girardeau. First name John, John. Middle name Howard, Howard, and I am the third. And make sure that gets on there because I have a son that uses the same name, and a father.
Branch service?
Field artillery.
And rank?
Current rank is lieutenant colonel. At the time of the Vietnam War, I was a second lieutenant and was promoted to first lieutenant while I was there. At that time, promotions were coming really fast, and you could get promoted from second to first in 12 months.
Let's start actually before the time you joined up. Tell me where you were, what year it was, what you were doing, what was going on in the country at the time, sort of as you moved towards the point you joined up.
Okay. My family has had a long history of military participation. My father was in World War II, a graduate of Clemson, ROTC. I went to Georgia Tech, ROTC, and was commissioned in November of '64. At that time, Vietnam was starting to come on the scene there. I went on active duty in January of '65 and did my artillery officer basic at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and from there went on to a heavy artillery battalion that was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Then went to a heavy artillery battalion that was at El Paso, Texas. During that spring, this is the spring of '65, of course Vietnam was starting to build up. It became apparent that U.S. troops were going to go. Since the unit I was with was an 8-inch battalion, our feeling was they're not going to use 8 inches in the rice paddies. So we weren't terribly concerned. But as time went along there, approaching into the summer, it became obvious that we might go, and they were starting to activate units. In the late summer, Lyndon Johnson started the big troop buildup, and we were in fact loaded on troop ships for a 31-day cruise from California to Vung Tau, Vietnam, and were offloaded there, and I stayed with my unit during that full year. The unit stayed intact.
31 days?
31 days.
What
and
was it like being aboard ship?
It was a very interesting experience. I can't remember the name of the ship, but it had been a World War II troop ship, and may have been one of the Ghost Fleet ships, I don't know. But it was completely refurbished. It looked like it had split in half one time during its career because it had this big steel band around the center of it. It was carrying about a 50% overload. The enlisted people were housed down in the hold of this thing in about 6 high bunks. And so each person had a bunk, and they were stacked all over the top of each other, and their equipment was sort of stacked at the end of their bunks. The lieutenants, the group that I was with, were in this little metal box of a cabin that was up on the deck toward the forward end of the ship. And we had 3 rows of 4 high bunks. There were 12 of us in this little tiny room. Only 1 or 2 people could stand up in the room at a time. The rest of you, everybody else had to either be in the bunks or outside the door. There was 1 table in there and 2 chairs, play cards or do something like that. As the trip went along, we started getting into rough weather. And everyone in the room, just about it, almost all of them, got seasick at one time or another. But there were about 3 or 4 holdouts. And I decided I would have a little fun with that. So I tied a string onto the light fixture over the table and put a weight on it. And it would sit there and rock with the ship. And that finished off the rest of them. That took care of that. Another interesting thing was when we started getting into rough weather. I remember one night, since we were up high up on the ship and we had a porthole, we could stick our head out and we could look down and see the portholes below us. and we noticed that one of the portholes was open. So we started taking bets on when the porthole would go under the water. And finally, at one point, it went about 15 feet under, and I'm sure those folks down there got drenched. The sort of the life cycle of the day involved people getting into the breakfast line, which would be coiled all over the ship, and then as soon as you get breakfast, you go stand in the lunch line, which coiled all over the ship, and then when you got through with that, you went and stood in the dinner line, which coiled all over the ship. Another aspect was, as people were standing up in line on the ship, they were usually throwing up all over the place. So about sundown, they'd herd everybody down below and hose off the top of the ship. The next morning, they'd get everybody up, and they'd hose off the whole area where everybody had been packed all night. So that's the way it was. No air conditioning, like a furnace, particularly once we got below the equator. But an interesting experience. Not your average cruise ship.
Now, when you cruised into the site of Vietnam, what did you see? What did you hear? What did you smell? What was it like?
Okay, we went first to Da Nang to drop off a couple of units, and then we went on down to Vung Tau, and I can remember we anchored out in the harbor there at Vung Tau, and at night they turned on lights all around the ship, and you could actually look down through the water and you could see sharks and all sorts of interesting fish down there. And they were worried about enemy divers coming in trying to sink the ship, so periodically they'd be throwing hand grenades over the side, and the ship was well guarded. We did the classic over the side of the ship disembarkation, crawling down the rope ladders into landing craft. And then we got landed on sort of a ramp area on Vung Tau, and were immediately loaded into trucks, and they took us out to the airfield there and loaded us on C-123s and C-130s. I can't remember which, but the small airplanes, and took us up toward Saigon. From there we moved out to what was known as the University of Saigon, which was really a big jungle, and we stayed there for about a month or so while we unloaded the ships. All of our equipment had come by ship and had come into Saigon Harbor. One of the interesting aspects there while we were at the University of Saigon, everybody was so trigger happy and afraid they'd only issue us 3 bullets. So we had a full battalion, and nobody had more than 3 bullets in the whole battalion. I don't know what would happen if the VC had attacked us or anything. But we stayed there for, like I say, about a month till we got all of our equipment. And then we said we were Corps Artillery, which is what heavy artillery is. We were assigned to the 1st Infantry Division. They further allocated us down to the 1st Brigade. Now, the 1st Brigade was going to go into Phuc Vinh, which is about 35 miles north of Saigon. We convoyed up to Phuc Vinh and were the first American troops into Phuc Vinh. It was essentially an airstrip with a government building and a bunch of huts is basically what the town was. The convoys, well, after we got set up there, then we had to have resupply convoys run every month. We ran one convoy every month down to Bien Hoa and Saigon over that 35-mile road. The VC were extremely active in that area. We were right in the middle of Zone D and Zone C. Whenever we did the convoy run, we actually had to station troops about every 100 feet on either side of the road during the day, run the trucks through as far as they could go, then pull everybody back into small, secure areas. On average, we took about 16 casualties per convoy, but that was the only way to get resupplied. Later on, they started bringing more stuff in by air. In the early days, by then I had been assigned as an air observer and as a ground forward observer. And during those days, I was usually with B Troop of the 1st of the 4th Cav. And the 1st of the 4th was used for screening. We'd go down about 1,000 or 2,000 meters out on each side of the road and move slightly ahead of the rest of the group that was clearing the road and posting the guards and that sort of thing. And whenever we'd run into anything, we'd shoot at them.
How were you so lucky as to be chosen a forward observer?
I was the junior lieutenant in the battalion.
That answers that.
I was also on court-martials, but that's a whole other. Usually,
court-martial?
Usually on the defense. Yeah, an interesting thing there. When I was there, the drug issue had not really raised its head, and this was about 6 months into the tour there, and the battery commander had gotten some rumors that some of his men were using marijuana, and rather than try to find them with informants, he and his first sergeant decided that they would conduct a midnight raid. And so they raided the people's sleeping area in the battery, and they came up with 2 or 3 bags of green vegetable material, which they assumed was marijuana. There were a couple of other people who had been witnessed smoking cigarettes that smelled funny. Well, I think there were a total of about 6, and the battalion commander decided he'd hold a court-martial. And I and another lieutenant were on the defense for the court-martial, he being the senior lieutenant. He was the first lieutenant, I was the second lieutenant at the time. And we used primarily as the defense of these people was that the prosecution could not identify the green vegetable matter. We charged it could be salad fixings or anything else. And no one could describe a peculiar smelling cigarette. And as a result, we got all 6 of them off, and were never asked to be on a court-martial again.
Forward observer has that reputation of painting a target on their forehead and going out there. Describe to me what it's like being out there, but also what it was like the first time you went.
The first time I went, I can't exactly remember the first time, other than the fact that it was with the Armored Cav Troop. And what you have to do is get into a real heavy state of alertness. The job of the forward observer, of course, is to call artillery. And back in the days that I was in, the training for artillery forward observers at Fort Sill involved standing on top of a hill, an OP or what have you, looking out across this vast plain and spotting a target out there at 3,000 or 4,000 meters, and you calmly shoot an azimuth to the target and get your grid coordinates and call your first rounds in, and they are going to land right next to the target, and then you just sort of bring them online and split the bracket, and you've got the target. Well, in Vietnam, the difference is you can't see that far. And so here you are out there. You have to keep track of where you are. That's the first thing you got to do. You got to keep track of where your firing batteries are. And then when something happens, it usually happens very fast. And the technique that I was using primarily was when we were getting ambushed, the ambushers were usually fairly close, and so I would just usually try to grab a grid square that was on the other side of the ambushers and get a volley on the ground and then just start moving it around in that area. Your question again is, what was it like being a forward?
What was it like to be out there?
Oh, yeah. What was it like to be out there?
You're out there.
Well, you're usually with other folks. You are not out there by yourself, but there's a signature. The enemy knows that when artillery starts coming in, they can figure there's somebody out there doing it. And they start looking for radio antennas is one of the things that I believe they do. On several occasions, I went with small group units. There, you really have to know where you are and what you're doing. I can recall being out with a very small unit, and I was their artillery support, and we would set up our perimeter at night, and I always made a habit of calling of arranging what are called H&I fires, harassment and interdiction fires. And what you do there is you pick out the trails and stream crossings and that sort of thing that are within a couple of kilometers of where you are. And you call those missions in and have the artillery shoot at those all night long. You know, every hour or so drop around on that. Then you also have, or I always had, my final fires. These are the ones that are real close to you. And they're not fired in. What you do is you do a map inspection, figure out exactly where you think you ought to have an artillery concentration pre-planned, and I'd call those in, and then I'd lie down on the ground on, usually on the gun target azimuth. I usually pick the gun target, lie down on the ground with my head towards the guns, and mentally figure where my concentrations were, and have the radio by my side, and then I'm set for the night. And if anything happens, you just pick up the radio and say, fire mission, Alpha Bravo Charlie 6, over, or adjust fire, and wait for that first volley to hit the ground. The more difficult jobs of being a forward observer were with one time when I was with the Arvin Rangers. And the problem that there were about 5 or 6 Americans and a battalion of Arvin Rangers. Actually, there were 2 battalions, and I was with one, and one of my good friends from my battalion was with the other battalion. And we were attached to the 173rd Airborne. But we were operating independently. And each one of these Arvin battalions would be moving in line through 5 canopy jungle. And we'd usually have, as I recall, 2 companies in column with a company in column on each flank, as it sticks in my mind, or maybe it was a platoon in column on the flanks. And we'd be moving through the jungle fairly fast. And 5 canopy jungle, I could see about 6 feet, and no way to get landmarks. You can't find landmarks. The technique that I developed, and here again, a lot of the techniques that I came up with, I had to come up with on my own because they were not from Fort Sill. We were the first people over there. I was not around any other forward observers. I was not around any liaison officers. I was out there with these units on my own. So I developed my own little techniques. And one of the techniques for finding my position in 5 canopy jungle was to shoot it myself. And basically there you call around until you find a 105 battery, and you call a fire mission on what you believe your location to be, and ask for a shell white phosphorus 200 meter height of burst. If you're lucky, this thing goes off right over the top of your head, 200 meters in the air. If it's not right above you, you use sound, because you can't see it. You just use sound and keep moving it around until it gets right over you. Then you call for a replot, and the firing battery can tell you what the grid coordinates are that your last shot hit. So then you know where you are. And then you just try to keep track of that until something happens. Now, at that particular time, we were making 3 or 4 contacts per day. And moving through the jungle, as a forward observer, I had to keep track of where all of the troops were. I was with the American advisor, and if all of a sudden you hear gunfire on one of your flanks or out front, what I would do as an observer was quickly call a fire mission, and since we're in 5 canopy jungle, I'd usually call for battery in adjustment, battalion in effect, if I could get it. And the idea was when the VC ambushed and the Arvin started pushing back at them, and if I had ample artillery fire behind the ambushers, we could hopefully chase them into the artillery. And so we would use lots of artillery whenever we could. In fact, on that operation, the other lieutenant with the Arvin Ranger Battalion and me, between the 2 of us, shot more artillery than the entire 173rd Airborne Brigade combined. And if you look at that, here we are, 2 observers, and they had, their brigade had 3 battalions. Each battalion has 3 companies, so it's 3, 6, 9, liaison officers 12. They probably had the equivalent of 15 observers. And we had 2, and we shot more than they did. But we were running into more stuff. We were moving. We were doing stuff. Let me get back to the point I was going there. We would be moving through the jungle. And one time, along at about sundown, we were hit by a squad to platoon. I don't remember exactly what it was. And I got the artillery going, and we were chasing them toward the artillery. And about the time we were doing that, we got word that there was an airstrike available if we wanted it. So we said, sure, we'll do that. So we called off the artillery, gave the forward air controller the approximate coordinates where we thought the VC were. The plane went in and dropped what he felt was a sufficient amount of ordnance, and we called it all off and settled down for the night. Now, at that time, too, or actually through the whole time, the Ranger, the Arvin troops, food ration included a bag of rice. And so about sundown, and this is not instant rice, this is the real cooking type rice. So about sundown, they had formed up their perimeter for the evening, and everybody had built a fire and start cooking their rice. And the problem was the VC did the same thing. So as an air observer, one of the things that you'd look for is a circle of smoke out in the jungle there, and you knew there was something that you could shoot at. Well, our sister battalion was about 3 or 4 kilometers from us, and the aircraft saw the ring of smoke because they had already settled down and went over and dropped the rest of his ordnance on them. Well, my good friend, fellow forward observer with that battalion happened to be Puerto Rican. Well, Chi-Chi flipped over into Spanish. And it was after midnight before I could get Chi-Chi to tell me what in the world was going on. But what had happened was the plane had dropped a couple of napalms that had missed, but he had dropped 2 or 3 fairly heavy bombs that had hit right in the target. In fact, one of them came to rest about 30 feet from Chi-Chi, but they were all duds. As a result, there were no casualties. But later that night, that Chi-Chi's Ranger Battalion got real upset with the Americans and decided that they would pick up and move. Well, that's a no-no over there. You don't move around in the dark. And so they went ahead and moved anyway. And they moved on top of one of my 175 concentrations. So then they started getting 175 fire. Then the VC figured out where they were, and they started getting hit by VC. Well, by the next morning, they were ready to revolt and threatening to kill the Americans and all that sort of thing. So the Americans were evacuated out, and they said, well, we'll just leave you Arvin Rangers out here to wander around in the woods without food and medical help and ammunition till y'all decide you want the Americans back. And several days later, they said they'd take the Americans back. And so that's the way that one went. Between you and me, that's sort of paraphrasing what's in here. You'll see that basic thread in there.
What was it like the first time you got shot at?
First time I got shot at. I can't remember exactly when that was either, but getting shot at, well, first of all, I had the reputation of being the most shot at man in the battalion. Because in the 8-inch battalion, most of those folks never moved in less than battery-sized units. And here I was out with all of these other folks, so I sort of kept track of what I got shot at with. And I figured I had everything that the VC had in country at that time, except for the 122 millimeter rockets, either pass through or land within 30 feet of where I was. That includes light and heavy mortars, light and heavy machine guns, RPGs, recoilless rifles. They had either passed through or landed within about 30 feet of where I was. And I came through without a scratch. But, yeah. Well, one of the things that I used, and I've passed this on to my son, who's actually in Army Intelligence now and has been over to Kuwait. There are 2 things that I used that helped me. One was the mud ball test. And may I use some some strong language, we can, and the other one is the dog shit test. Now, we can change that word if you want to. We can change that to the dog poop test. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. The mud ball test. As growing up down in South Georgia, being in a farming community, us kids would go out into the fields that had been plowed and that sort of thing and find these dirt clods and throw mud balls back and forth at each other. And we'd build little forts and all that sort of thing. Well, very on I learned when you're playing a game like that, you do what I call the mud ball test, which is figure out what can I put between me and the guy throwing the mud ball that'll stop the mud ball. Well, in Vietnam, that boiled down to getting flat on the ground and trying to get a vehicle or logs or trees or depressions or hummocks of dirt between you and whatever it was that's coming in. And that's the mud ball test. And I'd sit there when it starts coming, that's what I'd start figuring. The other one is the dog poop test. Now here again, back down in South Georgia, us little kids out there playing, particularly around Christmas time, when we had a lot of firecrackers, we'd go out and find a nice big juicy pile of dog poop and put a cherry bomb up in the middle of it and dare the other little kids to stand around next to it. Well, one of the things that we learned was if you lie down on the ground right next to it, and then right after it goes off you get up and run, you won't get touched. But if you're standing up, you're going to get splattered. And a very good example of that sort of thing, or the result of that. One time while I was out with the Armored Cav, and it was at night, and we were in a perimeter type position. Troop commander had one of these little hex tents. I don't know, it's maybe 12, 14 feet in diameter. And we had, 3 of us had our cots set up in there. And it was dark. I had managed to find a couple of canteens full of water and had washed myself down and put on clean underwear. And that was rare. You stayed dirty almost all the time, particularly in the dry season. And I was lying there on my cot. We had a gasoline lantern on. The troop commander and I believe his executive officer and maybe a couple of other folks were over next to his bunk looking over maps to try to figure out what they were going to do for the next day. And all of a sudden heard all kinds of gunfire take off. Well, I immediately flipped out flat on the ground in the dust and dirt and lay there cussing and fuming about getting my underwear dirty again because I didn't have that much more. And, just all sorts of stuff broke loose then. Well, the other guys had stayed up, and then they jumped up and ran out and got into the armored personnel carrier that was backed up to the tent. We always had the armored personnel carrier just backed up to the tent. And I was still flat on the ground. And then I jumped up, turned off the lamp, and went and piled into the back of the armored personnel carrier with everybody else. And all of a sudden one of the guys says, "Hey, I've been hit in the leg." And the other one says, "I think I got hit in the arm." And the other one says, "I got a little something here in my cheek." And then we heard this voice said, "Ooh, I've been hit in the head." And the voice came from down below, and somebody found a flashlight, and we sort of just parted. And here, lying in the bottom of the APC, stark naked, was my recon sergeant with blood all down his face. And I figured, oh my gosh. There goes Sergeant Mad-Eye, a very good recon sergeant, and I think he's bought the farm here. So after that, we went ahead and fought the war. There was all sorts of VC were assaulting our side of the perimeter. I couldn't use a radio inside the APC, so quite often I'd climb out behind the back of the APC on the ground and use my radio from there. After the battle was over, we went back and drug Sergeant Mad-Eye out of the APC and laid him on the ground and brought the medic over, and he took a canteen of water and washed off the blood, and took out his tweezers and pulled this little BB-sized thing out of his forehead and wrote him up for a Purple Heart. And that's all it was. But that tent became known as the Starlight Room after that. What had happened was the VC, using 60 millimeter mortars, which really broke up into little BB-sized things, had used 2 mortars and walked them across the compound. And one hit at each corner of that tent. And it was the Starlight Room. And the thing that saved me on that one was the dog poop test. Get flat on the ground, and all those other folks didn't.
How did you live day to day with all the things out in that vegetation that aren't strict enemy, but you know, insects?
I've got you some good tales on that one. Here again, early on, you asking what we did early on. Well, one of the first things that we did when we got into Phuc Vinh was start running ambush patrols. We knew the VC were around us. And so we were running squad size, I believe they were, ambush patrols, leg infantry. And they'd put a forward observer out there with them. And we'd go out, we'd leave the perimeter, and go forward 2,000 or 3,000 meters, and wait till sundown, and then right at sundown, we would move into an ambush position on a trail that we thought the VC might come down. Once you got into position there, you didn't move, say nothing, stand up or anything, or you'd get shot. Well, one night I was on one of those, and just as I'd gotten settled down, and it was in, waist-level brush maybe, and I was settled down, and just watching around, and I saw a big ant come wander by. And a few minutes later, here came 3 more ants. And a few minutes later, here came about 25 or 30 ants. And the next thing I knew, there were thousands of ants. And they just walked right on over me, didn't bite, didn't do anything. And all I could do was just lie there and let them go by. And after about an hour or so, they moved on off. And so that was a case of very strong discipline of keeping your mouth shut, because if I'd said anything, I could have gotten shot with that one. Another one, well, the other interesting thing was the size of the insects over there. And I can remember one time in a rubber plantation. Here again, this was back with the Armored Cavalry. And I was running for some reason through there, and all of a sudden my face went through something, and I ended up landing up flat on my back, as much as shock as anything else. It wasn't a strong force, but it frightened me enough for me to land on my back. And I got to looking up there, and between 2 rubber trees, and they're pretty well spaced out, at about 8 or 9 feet in the air, was one of the biggest garden spiders I have ever seen in my life. That sucker must have been 12 inches across, 12 inches from leg to leg. Beautiful spider, really nice spider. But a 12-inch spider and a little above head level is bad news. Another interesting thing that would happen, this was in the dry season, they had these fire ants that were really ferocious. They'd jump on the end of a burning cigarette and try to sting it. And on the armored personnel carriers, when we were moving through rubber or any place else, the constant fear was mines. And so they'd sandbag the bottoms of the APCs, and all the people would sit on top of the APC, not in it, on top of it. And you'd see an APC sort of cutting out through the rubber plantation. All of a sudden, you'd see everybody just abandon that thing, just everywhere, just scattering. And well, what had happened was, as they were going along there, the antenna had hit one of these fire ant nests up in the rubber tree and just showered those things down everybody's neck. And so everybody would stand around and chase ants for 3 or 4 minutes, and then get back on the APC and move on. Another, snakes didn't have as much problem with snakes, had more trouble with scorpions and other things. Now, one time when I was out This was back with the Oregon Rangers, I believe. There, I had taken my poncho and some line and made myself sort of a hammock and strung it up between two banana trees and was sort of sleeping along during the night, and I woke up and I felt this thing going like this across my face. And I figured, whoops, I got a problem. And so I just came back real slowly and did that. And he got me in this little finger. And my whole arm just went dead. But that was sort of the hazard that you had to deal with there. Scorpions were everywhere. You always shook your boots out in the morning. Now, there was a very interesting tale about that. At the Battle of Tan Ben, which is one of the ones that that some of that literature was. The Battle of Tan Ben, after that was over, I decided I'd try to find a little souvenir to take back, and it was in a rubber plantation. And so I found one of the little ceramic rubber bowls, the little bowls that they collect the rubber sap in. When I got back to our base there at Phuc Vinh, I just took it, and it was sort of sticky and that sort of thing, so I just wrapped it up in the newspaper and stuffed it in the bottom of my duffel bag. Didn't think anything else of it. Then when I was shipping out from Vietnam, I found that thing in my duffel bag and just didn't even unwrap it. I knew what it was, put it in my duffel bag, and headed on back to the States. As we were coming through customs, of course, they unloaded everything in your duffel bags, and the inspector there unwrapped the rubber bowl, and right there in the middle of it was about a 4-inch long scorpion, long since dead, but he was there. And that guy went ballistic. Here I was smuggling some foreign creature into the country. I didn't even know that thing was there. I thought he was going to take me off to jail, but I didn't even know it was there. But scorpions were real bad. Let's see if I can think of another insect one. There was one guy in one of the batteries that was collecting the biggest scorpion. Whenever somebody would bring him a bigger one, he'd throw a smaller one away. The last I heard, he was up to about 8 inches long. At the Phuc Vinh, when we were at Phuc Vinh there, we were staying in GP medium tents on dirt floors. And in the rainy season, that's pretty bad. So what we did was we got a hold of some ammunition crates and sort of lined the floor of our tent. Well, I don't remember what season it was, but the termites had gotten into that thing, and they suddenly decided it was mating season and they were all going to take off. And that tent was filled with flying termites. I'm not talking about little ones, I'm talking about 1/2-inch long ones. And I remember I was trying to write a letter home to my wife on a footlocker there, and the only light we had was candles. And these darn things were everywhere, and they kept flying through the candles. And I ended up with a letter full of those things. I went ahead and dropped it in the mail and sent it home. So she could see what we were dealing with there.
When you were out, how did you put up with just the day-to-day?
There was a lot of boredom, an awful lot of boredom. Basically, just keeping track of where you were and just trying to stay comfortable. It was hot as a son of a gun, very uncomfortable. My personal record for going without a bath or change of clothes was 30 days. So we were a pretty rank crew by the time we got back in and got a shower. The only food, and we went literally for months with nothing but sea rations. Here again, back with this Operation Toledo group, one time we came back in from the field, and I didn't have any, and the American officers wanted to go over to the MACV headquarters for dinner, a little R&R there. And I didn't have a clean uniform, so Lieutenant Jones, about my size, loaned me a clean set of fatigues. I was a second lieutenant, he was a first lieutenant. I was artillery, he was infantry. He had all the MACV patches and Ranger tabs and all that sort of stuff. So here I was impersonating first lieutenant. Not only that, we would look like twins over there. But the uniform fit. So we went on over to MACV headquarters. And I had been out in the field for gosh knows how long, been living off of sea rations, and had not had any alcohol. Well, I had 2 vodka gimlets. I can remember those. And we went into the dining room and had a very nice filet with, I believe it was string beans and a tossed salad. And after that was over, I was not feeling too good after that. And I remember we were going to go back in and sit around and talk and have a few more drinks or something. And I excused myself and went out in front of MACV headquarters, and there was some general staff car out there. And I was just feeling, and I went over and threw up all over the left front tire of that thing, and then staggered over and passed out next to the flagpole. And it must have been 3 or 4 hours before they found me. They were getting desperate as to whether or not I'd been kidnapped. But they got me back together and got me back out to the place where we were staying. But that's what happened. That's how rich food could affect you after living off of C rations.
How did you put up with the stress of losing people that were in your group?
You got to sort of ignoring it. You really did. You could say, well, that's the way it goes. I mean, we had one battle, the Battle of Tan Binh, which is one of the ones that I've got the information here for you. At the Battle of Tan Binh, for example, we had, here again I was with the Armored Cav at that time. We had 9 tanks and 21 APCs in that unit. And we were set up on line, and the troop commander's track was behind the line, sort of centered, and to its right rear was the medic track. Along about 2 o'clock in the morning, and we were with the 1st Brigade, we were with the Infantry 1st Brigade, and there was an artillery battery and an infantry battalion, and we were formed up in sort of a triangle, with the Armored Cav on one leg of the triangle, the infantry on another leg, and the artillery on another leg. The VC attacked into our flank, which is absolutely the worst place they could have attacked, and they got within about 50 feet of the concertina wire and started hitting trip flares, and that's when we discovered they were there. Actually, our listening post started seeing. In fact, got a call in from the listening post of, hey, there are a bunch of folks out here walking around through the woods, what are we supposed to do? And about that time, all hell broke loose. The 9 tanks and 21 APCs, of course, they had 9 90-millimeter guns. They had each had a 50-caliber machine gun. Each had a 30-caliber machine gun. The 21 APCs each had a 50-caliber machine gun and a 30-caliber machine gun. And they were just hammering the VC on that flank. But the VC were doing pretty much to us, too. The tank that was right next to our APC, it took a mortar round down the hatch. Well, that pretty well did those folks in. The troop, one of the platoon leaders tried to go out and bring the listening post in, so we ended up with a tank and an armored personnel carrier out forward of our lines. And the people in the APC managed to get into the tank, and the VC kept trying to blow the hatches on the tank, and the other tanks could see it, and so they would keep it dusted off with canister rounds. From where I was sitting, in the back of the troop commander's APC, I could look out to the back, because I had to be at the back and actually had to get out of the back to find out anything about artillery. But the VC was shooting RPGs at the medic track, and they were wounded on the ground behind the medic track. And so I could sit there and just see them popping these things off the front of the APC, and that's 30, 40 feet away. Looking out to the rear of the APC was the artillery battery. And that's 6 guns, 105, in a field. And about 200 yards in front of them was a tree line, rubber tree line. And the VC had set up recoilless rifles in that. And for over an hour, it was like a ping pong game with the artillery shooting direct fire into the tree line and the VC shooting recoilless rifles back at the artillery. Well, since the artillery was out in the field, if they didn't hit a gun or a person, those rounds just went straight on through and landed in the back of the infantry. Those folks weren't too happy with that. But the artillery had the advantage in that they could hit trees and get air bursts. And so they were cleaning up on VC. At the end of the battle, and here again you have to understand that as those battles are going on, the VC would police up their dead and get them back off the field. And so really the only people that you knew had died were within the last 20 or 30 minutes of the battle. Well, after the battle was over, we found 140 some odd bodies. And Air Observer the next day spotted, I believe it was 10 ox carts loaded with bodies off moving several kilometers away. So we exacted a pretty heavy toll. I think I heard estimates as high as 360. Out of that, we only had 11 killed. And probably 3 or 4 or 5 of those were in the Armored Cav Troop. I know the mortar round down the tank got several, and there was another APC that got hit badly. But as you're going through that, you just got to move on. You know, hey, you know, let's fix it up the best we can and keep going.
As you begin to get closer to your time that you get to ship out, how did that affect you? By then I was pretty well experienced, and as I could influence, well, my unit leadership, I think, recognized that, and they sort of pulled me back a little bit. As I recall, I spent a lot more time doing other things toward the end. Actually, I had extended for an extra month. At that time, if you were within 90 days of getting out, then you could get an early out from the Army. And if I extended a month, I would be within that 90-day window. So I did that. As I recall, that's when I spent a lot of time as Battalion Fire Direction Officer, S2, Air Observer, you name it. As sort of a general thing, in World War II, people went for the duration. Korea and Vietnam, essentially they were there for a year. That varied, but and you know, you look at it, you understand the decision, but you have constant waves of rank amateurs coming in, and about the time you really know what you're doing, you go home.
That is one of the flaws of Vietnam. As you said, in World War II, and I believe in Korea, they maintained unit integrity. They'd move entire units, and the people knew each other. In Vietnam, the unit stayed in place, and they just kept replacing people. Well, I was lucky in that my entire unit went over, and we didn't start rotating people back until 9 months into the tour. So we had a pretty cohesive group of people by the end of my tour, and in that I was extremely lucky and quite happy with that. Other units that were taking casualties, they were getting replacements moved in as they took casualties. And one of the things that we noticed, it's sort of the infant light bulb failure syndrome. I don't know if you're familiar with that. If you screw in a light bulb, if it lasts the first 30 minutes, it's probably going to last the next hour. If it lasts the next hour, it's probably going to last the next 5 hours, and so on and so forth. And if they're going to die, they're going to die young. Well, one of the things that we noticed is most of our casualties had fewer than 30 days in country. If you made it past the first 30 days, you were usually in pretty good shape.
Tell me about going home.
Going home, now that one was a little rough. All of our uniforms had been pretty well worn out, mine were, so at the end of the tour I just took all of my fatigues and threw them in the trash can. And really all I had was summer khakis, the old starch summer khakis. And you were supposed to wear your Class A uniform home. Went down to Saigon for out-processing there, wearing my summer uniform, short-sleeve khaki. Flew commercial air. We got back to, I believe it was Hawaii. Had to have a fuel stop. The disconcerting thing there was that they let us off of the airplane onto the tarmac. We couldn't go anywhere else, just off onto the tarmac. And we were all standing around out there, and the pilot and some other funny dressed folks would come over and pull the covers off of the engine and stand around and shake their heads and put the covers back on the engines, and we'd get back in, and we flew into, I believe it was Alaska, and we did the same thing then of getting out and standing around, and it wasn't Alaska, it was somewhere. Flew to the next stop. It wasn't a direct flight. And they'd get out and stand around and pull the covers off the engine, look at it, shake their heads, and get back in, and we'd fly on. But we got into Fort Dix, New Jersey at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And here I am in my summer uniform. It's early October, and there's frost on the ground. And I'd gone from 110-degree heat to frost on the ground in one day. Then they didn't have any BOQs or anything like that for me. I sat around in a BOQ room until about 8 o'clock in the morning. I had to go for an Army physical. I had to go for my out-processing physical. And have you ever been through an Army physical? But at Fort Dix, they were processing us through with a bunch of recruits, and you stand around in these old World War I wooden buildings in your underwear, and that physical took over 8 hours, or almost 8 hours, to go through that, and it's just a standard basic physical. And I got all the way down to the end of that thing. And the only thing I had left to do was have my form typed up, and I could go catch a plane and go home. That was the last thing I had to do. Well, as I got up to the lady who was typing the stuff, she says, "Well, it's quitting time. I'm going home. You'll have to wait till tomorrow." And I said, "Lady, I'm not waiting. I'm getting that form typed right now. I'm going to go find the post commander." And I headed out the door to go find General whoever so that I could get my form fixed so I could get home, because I hadn't seen my wife in 13 months. Well, they straightened out real fast. They got that form done and got everything squared away. And by then, I was so tired, I figured, well, I'm just going to sleep tonight, and I'll catch the plane in the morning, because it was getting late by then. But that 8-hour physical, that was ridiculous. But I was mad. I'd talk about being irritated. I was going to the post commander. I was going to find him.
Tell me about getting all the way home. You got a wife at the other end.
Yeah, well, she had, of course, what we had done there was, my family was from South Georgia, her family was from upstate New York, so we'd split the difference, and she'd settled here in Richmond. And we had a young son, our oldest son by then, and the biggest problem I think that she had was there was the backlash against the war was starting, and she felt that she could not, in any comfort, tell anybody where I was or what I was doing, and that really got to her quite a bit. And then, but she handled the household stuff fine, so she was in pretty good shape with that. And of course, then when I got back, the conflict that we had there was, I wanted to just sit down and stare at the trees for a month or two. And she, of course, was wanting to go ahead and get on with life a little bit. So I went ahead and applied for a job with DuPont, Spruance plant here in town, and got the job. And in 3 or 4 weeks there, I had gone from killing and maiming people to making string in a plant. No slow down, turn down, nothing. That was it. From killing to making string. And so that's the extent of the decompression there.
So going from 110 to 24 degrees?
That's right. Same way. But that's the way they were treating the veterans coming back from Vietnam. There were no parades, you recall. There was no family assistance. There was no nothing. And that, I think, is what's caused a lot of the problems with the Vietnam veterans.
Plus, you're out of contact over there. You get over here and you find out politically what's happening.
Yeah.
How old was your son when you got back?
Let's see, he was born in '64, and I got back in end of '66, so he was 2.
So he forgot who you were?
That's right. Had to start over again with son John. Incidentally, though, in carrying on the family's military tradition, he's in Army intelligence now. But rather than, and he graduated from Randolph-Macon, but rather than go the officer route, he decided he'd have more fun as enlisted, and he's done very well with that.
Okay. Well, I thank you for coming today.
You're welcome.
Great story. See, you didn't have to refer to that at all.
That's right.
That worked.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.